3 p.m. So I have to get all the way. That's what causes.
Can our Zoomers hear?
They're all muted.
Can I hear them?
Yeah, they should be able to.
Can you, okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right, so it's July,
Wow.
September. September. I have to actually look at the date that says that. September 20th, 2021, it's currently 6 p.m. and we call to order the Special Board of Education meeting. We are still operating under a gubernatorial disaster proclamation. And we are hosting this meeting tonight virtually because I've determined that it's safe and practical for the public to be present at the public body's normal meeting place. Gail, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Kosky?
Here.
Dr. Maharaj? Mr. Arkin?
Here.
Mr. Henry? Mr. Martieri?
Here.
Ms. Harris?
Here.
Ms. Dixon Spivey?
Here. All right, our first item of business this evening is public comments. Gail, do we have any this evening?
No.
All right, so this meeting this evening is to do a deep dive into finance, and I want to thank Board Secretary Tom Kosky for the extraordinary amount of work that he's done on this. And Ralph will also be assisting with some evidence-based funding information, so thank you to both of them. Tom, do you want to take it away?
I will.
Thank you.
So the framework for the agenda here, the objective of today's meeting is to provide, I would say, financial perspective that can allow us as board members to make informed decisions. And so in looking at the agenda, it's broken up into a couple segments. The beginning part is Cindy will go through kind of the structure of the finances, the different funds and how they work, because that's a key part to understanding, and she's got a table that will kind of, I think, put that in perspective. And then talk about how the levy works, and what some of the challenges that we face in levying. So that's the kind of the starting point. Then I'm a big historian, so to try to answer the question, how did we get where we are? We often look to the future and where we think we'll be, but what I will do is take us down memory lane and try to explain what events and activities and trends happened that kind of positioned us where we are. So, and that is the result of decisions made by board members past, and hopefully will then be at least some help for us as a board to the present and future. So that's the second major area. And then the third area is talking about where do we stand, and to do that, to get, I would call it comparative or an external perspective. How do we look compared to other things? And in that case, we'll look at other districts' financial picture, just to get a handle of, are we an outlier or are we in the middle? Where are we? And then I've called upon Ralph to talk a little bit about the evidence-based fund perspective, because that's another comparative perspective on a statewide basis using benchmarks. So that's the plan. It probably is best to be interactive questions. There's gonna be a lot of kind of data shown that's gonna be interactive when we get into the where have we been. It's one where you can write a report, but there's a million ways to look at things. So I'm going to do a little show and tell. So with that, I would like for Cindy to lead us off and talk about fund balances and such and what they mean. while she's getting set up, I'm gonna just kind of fill in. There were a couple articles attached in the minutes, or in the agenda. And so they will be referenced but not reviewed in detail. And that's just gonna be, that's meant to provide a perspective for those who really want to understand better. Some of the things and some of the materials that I'm using are actually materials that were birthed in 2013 with the Financial Advisory Committee, because there was a big financial overview that was done before that committee commenced its business. So I've pulled from those materials as well as asked for some of them to be updated to be reflected in 2021. So with that, take it away, Cindy.
Thank you, Mr.
I'm not sharing that.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. So the first thing we look at when we start with school accounting is that we're about fund balances. So with fund balances, you have 10 through 90. And with basically 10 always being our largest because that's for education. Gave the, what we did is gave the fund account number, gave the fund name, gave a small description. It basically is the description of the expenditures in there. And then also see, we talked about whether we levy into these accounts. Because some accounts are not, you don't levy into them. You actually have to transfer into them. That leads us into the next scenario of transfer to and from. So you could transfer to these accounts and then it'll tell you what accounts you can transfer from. The one thing that I wanted to point out too is with fund accounting, the other side is you have restricted accounts and you also have operating accounts. Your operating accounts are fund 10, 20, 40, and 70. Those are considered your operating. So when we talk about the operating, you'll see sometimes we'll show this is the percentage we have from our operating funds, and this is the percentage we have as overall fund balance. Well, to give an example to understand like when you have to actually transfer something, one would be our maintenance, it would be our capital that we actually do each year. Is we have to take and we have to transfer money from usually it's fund either 20 or fund 10 that has been transferred to fund 60 to pay for the capital costs. We cannot make a transfer without a board resolution. The board has to approve us being able to transfer the funds from one fund to another.
Are there questions on, I guess, how the funds work at this level? Right?
Thank you for this. This is the best I've seen. I haven't seen this before. This is a layout of all the funds and how it works. But I want to get an idea of the difference between, fund 20 and fund 60. And you don't, for capital projects, you don't levy. Okay. And when you say transfer, you're saying transfer from fund to fund, I'm assuming.
Correct.
Not just expend out of it.
Correct. Right. And right, yes.
But on fund 60, we don't levy for it, so where does the money come from? How do we get the money in there?
Great question. That'll actually come from either fund 10, 20, 70, or it could be a combination. Normally, we've seen it come from, for high school, we've seen it come from fund 20. We have seen some come from fund 10 though too. That is when we did the 20 million transfer that came from fund balance fund.
But you can levy for fund 20, so is there a subtle difference between the two funds? Between 20 and 60?
Oh, yes. So for fund 60, it's just capital. So it's capital improvements that we're doing to the building or improvements. So you cannot levy into that. What you have to do is you have to have, you put it into one of the accounts you can transfer from. And then you have to have a board resolution that's actually explaining this is why we're transferring this money. So when we levy, we're actually looking at not only what the expenditures are for Fund 20, but also too, what's going to be the capital that has to come out of that too.
So I guess, I see defined in 20, both, there's the last sentence, capital improvement projects are included in the fund.
Mhm.
Capital project fund, oops, sorry. And the capital, under 60 is major capital improvements, so I'm trying to figure out the difference. Now, for example, we know we have a capital improvement project of, I don't know, a lot of money for the roofs. So is that a 20, is that
That's a
a
60.
60? That is, okay, so,
That's a 60.
so is there a line of demarcation, or how do you know which goes where?
So we know that when we take and we do the budget, how much money actually is going into Fund 20. That is including regular O&M expenses, plus capital for Project 1, plus capital for the maintenance. That's, we levy to what we need to levy for. Now, there are times too, what you need to levy for, you're not gonna have, there isn't enough to levy for in Fund 10, or I'm sorry, in Fund 20. So you have to either levy out more into Fund 70 or into Fund 10, and then you go ahead and also transfer from those accounts to some of the capital. Is that
Yeah, thank you.
okay?
Okay. Are there any questions from those in Zoom world?
No, it's very clear. Thank you.
Okay. All right. The only supplemental comment I will make is that in my history, we really recently have gotten more intentional about levying directly for capital, saying how much money we were going to spend in capital, whereas in earlier history, we just levied and then kind of moved things around. So it's been a little more intentional to do that at least in the last 1 or 2 years, I'm guessing. Okay, so with that said, we're going to move to Chapter 2, which is Cindy is going to talk about the levy.
I think that's just a board.
There's no
That's just a
document.
board.
This is just,
That's a-
Well, the document
There's a
is
memo.
in board docs, yes.
Oh, it is in board doc?
just open up the item,
Yes.
Okay,
It's
And
in the
you'll see it.
agenda item.
just click on it. It'll pop up.
this one here.
Yep. Nope, the one above that, just click on it. Nope, the one below that. It's the one in between the two.
That's the right here, right?
One
Oh,
more.
this one.
Right there.
Oh,
There you go.
okay.
So when we look at the levy, basically what we're looking at is CPR, what are we going to be allowed to have for the year? And there is something called PTEL, or better known as the tax cap, and long term is property tax extension limitation law. With that limits the increase in property tax extension to 5%, or the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, whichever is less. It does not count in construction, and nor does it take on in interest obligations. Currently, this district does not have any bond or interest obligations. So for the new construction, it allows districts to levy additional property taxes for increases in the assessed value related to new construction. It also, or the reclassification of exempt property to non-exempt. The one point here though too is you have to take this in the first year that it rolls onto the taxes, or you will not be able to take it. So if there was new property for this year when we were working on the levy and we did not take it, we would not be able to come back next year and ask for it. We would lose that part. There's a look back provision, and for that, what happens is districts who want to reduce their extension in 1 year, what they're allowed to do is go back 3 years and take a look, and they can pick their highest levy, or extension that they had used. So I gave a little bit of an example where you had 10 million, 9 million, and 9 million, 1,000. In that example, you would have to use 9 million, 1,000, because the year prior to that was lower. You're not allowed to go back. You just have to use your highest year. I can see. So what happens in that is you're going over it. It's just 10 million, 9 million, and because that third year was the highest, you have to go with that because that is actually higher than your prior year. So this now became your new highest year. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the next one is you have 10 million, 9 million, 8,999,000. With that, you're allowed to go back to the 10 million because it was a decline in the 2 years, and then you go back to the prior year of the highest, which is 10 million. Referendum.
Great, I mean, does everyone
I will.
get that? Because I had to,
Yeah,
I lived it,
Yeah.
but I had to look at it again.
Yeah.
So I just, it's a nuance of the levy code, so, does anyone need further, or we can move on? Okay, great.
All right. And the other we talked about was a referendum, which is a PTEL district must use one or more referendum options to raise more taxes than allowed by the cap. One of them is to increase the extension limitation. The other is to increase the limiting rate. Another one is to levy for a new tax rate, and the other is to increase the debt service extension base. But this is basically put on a ballot for the voters to vote on, where you would ask the question, will you allow me, and you put in a percentage, and then you basically will say what the percentage will be. For the first one, this one can, this inflationary is an increase that is greater than allowed by PTEL for 1 or more years. The increasing of the limiting rate can be increased up to 4 years. And the last one is again, you have to ask the voters for these, for them to approve it. You can't just go and put this in.
With that said, are there, the last levy kind of piece of interest, if you could just talk, is timing.
Yes.
When
When do we start? I'm sorry.
what's the timing of the levy, just so that we are all on the same page?
Somebody else. Somebody talking. Okay. So for the levy, normally what we do is we start looking at it in October. We start to piece it together, and then we will have a meeting normally with we call it CFAC. It's Community Finance. I don't know what we'll call it, committee. Is that it? CFC.
Yeah.
CFC. Okay. So we'll have a meeting with them in October, and then by November we should be presenting it to the board. Then in December. If the board is not voted on in November, we could bring it back in December. The board would vote on it, and we have to have it by the last Tuesday in December to Cook County.
And there's nothing, and then it's done.
In this one, but you can abate if you
Right.
want to abate. Oh, no, okay.
That's,
You didn't have that. Boy, you tricked me on this one and this one. So this one you have to do by March. You have to abate and let Cook County know if you're going to abate your taxes by March.
so
once you've submitted your quote unquote final levy,
Yep.
if you choose to reduce it,
Yep.
you have that capability.
Correct.
You can't increase it, but you can reduce it.
I think Mary Ann may have a question. Do you still have a question, Mary Ann?
I do. It's about the bond debt. So I'm just curious, and I don't know if this is the right place to ask, but I'll ask. At the library, we were retiring the bond debt while I was there, and I think we just finished it. So the bonds were issued a long time ago to cover the cost of construction for the new main library building. My question is, if I'm understanding what you said, this OPRF doesn't currently have any bond or interest obligation. How is it decided whether to take on bond debt or as opposed to using one of these other funding mechanisms for new construction?
So what we actually did is we were looking at the debt that we could possibly have coming up, whether it be CIP, whether it be the projects for Imagine, or if we have life safety. Normally what we do is we take a look at what our 5-year projection is, what the amount is that's being requested, and if the board is approving what's going to be worked on, the other thing we'll do then is possibly come in and say, here is some bonds that we could possibly take, because this will keep us within our basically our targeted balance of 25 to 75% of fund balance.
I think I get that. So I'll think about it a little bit more. So it's if I'm understanding it, like you would use it as a mechanism to sort of help with the budgeting process. Okay. All right.
To keep us within our target range of where we need to be for fund balance.
Mm-hmm. And then can I ask, just so that I can explain it to members of the public if this should come up. So if someone comes to me and asks, why don't you take on debt for the new construction, of the pool or whatever it is, and, just budget for paying the interest, over the next 10 years, rather than continuing to raise our property taxes by CPI, what would the response be to that?
Well, I would say that the response would actually be the fact that if you look at your fund balance that you have, if you're carrying a high fund balance, and you would look at that and say, well, let me, I can start using some of my fund balance to pay for this, bring my fund balance down, especially if you're above where you're projecting you should be for your balances. So that's one way to look at it. The other is the fact that you're paying interest on that.
Right.
So why do you want to pay interest on something that you really, you can already cover with some of the fund balance you have?
Yeah, no, I think I understand why you would use the fund balance and reduce the fund balance. I think it's like that part is very clear to me. The bit about if someone says, you're taxing at 3%, it's been a hard year, can't you just take a year at 0% and issue more bond debt? I think the answer is that's not actually fiscally responsible, because the school will end up paying more money for this cost in the long run. Is that correct?
They would if we take bond and we're paying interest, but I would also say that the district last year did not take CPI. We also made it back the year prior to that too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's all very helpful. Thank you.
And Mary Ann, I would add, it's related to the topic, and it's one that there's been a lot of discussion on over the years. Which is why would you take on bonds, even if we had a fund balance, and I'm not saying the size we had, where the whole concept of matching the who's paying for it, so that if you take on debt, that's money that will be we will tax for or get in the next 20 years. And that coincides with when, if we were to build something, that asset would be utilized, so it's trying to match the expense with the use. Is part of that answer, so.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions of Cindy on the general nuances of the levy? Okay. So now we're gonna flip, and I'm not sure, it's called Welcome to Tom's World, because we're going into Excel, okay?
You go
And
to-
for those who don't know, I will do it, I'm just giving a little bit of color. I bet you if you looked in the huge stockpiles of love letters that I wrote my wife, some of them might have been written in Excel, so I'm just kind of pushing you to where my world is. So deal with it. So I'm gonna try to, what do I need to do here?
Share on the bottom set, which shows
I
actually.
don't see it, but. There it is. Okay, yeah, I just was kind of narrow. Okay, so I'm gonna make it bigger and we're gonna kind of go through it. I do have a little bit of colors in here for eyes. Let me just see what happens if I do this. Okay. And I'm gonna, Cindy's taught me a few things in life, which is, I'm gonna bring it to graphs in a minute, but I'm starting with numbers. And in all of the things that we're looking at, it's a 17-year kind of look. We just started at 2003. And so this will always be a fiscal year starting at 2003. And so we're going to talk about the history of our levy. And then I'm going to compare it to a few things just to get you perspective. And the goal is to try to answer the question. Yep.
I'm just curious why you started with 2003. Is there a particular reason that is your picked?
No, because I just went back really 2 sets of 10 years and kind of got there, and so there was no magic to it. Okay, technically I wanted to get to what I would call at least in or the other side of the infamous phase-in. So I wanted to cover the phase-in. Okay. So if you look at this chart, this column is our levy dollars. So in 2003, we levied 42,000,009. And in 2020, we levied 73,000,004. So, and I'm gonna, do some kind of comparisons, and I'm gonna highlight a few things in here that we just talked about that are part of tax, the levy policy that all came into play. So they were kind of plants for it. So the big thing is in 2003, we're dealing with a referendum that this district did. And I copied and sent out an article and a PowerPoint presentation that I'm not intending on going through. I mean, that's reading material for you as board members. If you have questions, you can ask them, and we'll try to address them. But essentially what happened is we had a referendum that coincided with an explosion in our EAV at the same time. And for whatever reasons, and one of the article talks about the rights of the board or whatever, that levy was phased in. And that meant that instead of taking the levied amount in terms of the, the limit, the rate, okay? Because if that had happened, it would have been a ginormous increase, like January, then it was done in a couple whacks. But each of those whacks were substantive. So you'll see my first color is yellow, and yellow has two monstrous increases in our tax levy back in the early 2000s. Okay, so that's point one to focus on. And if you look, I'm just gonna kind of go through my columns so that you can understand them as I refer to them. So this is your CPI, okay? And then this is your levy. And Cindy just said, well, you can levy up to CPI, and I'm being simplistic. So we're saying, well, how did our levy compare to CPI if we had levied all the way at CPI? So I'm gonna just start at the bottom and I'll back into it. So what this says is that our levy is 71% higher than it was 17 years ago. CPI is up 41% higher. So that says that over this period of time, we have levied more than CPI. And the predominant impact or thing that drove that happened 17 years ago or 20 years ago with the phase in that increased our base levy by a lot of money. Okay. So that's what that shows. I'm gonna go over and go right here. Can you see the red column? I don't know, folks. This is how many dollars more than CPI our levy is, just to give a kind of perspective of what the impact of that was. So essentially, and this is the compounding of the early 2003, 2004 of the phase in was that we basically boosted our tax levy to roughly 10 million a year more than CPI, 10, 11, etc. So that was a jolt. There's another event that happened in 2008, and I'm not sure of the details of why there was a blip, but there was some kind of thing that was done. I missed that one, okay? The next point of interest, at least in my historical lesson, is that this advisory committee assembled and they said, wait a second, our fund balance, well I'm gonna just jump over here, okay? Because this right here is our fund balance. So our fund balance in 2003 was $20 million. We do this phase in and you see it go 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, boom, 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 and you're $117 million, which, you know, you're up $100 million as a result essentially of that early phase in work, okay? So then what happened is in 2013, the community, that the financial advisory committee said, we got to change the trajectory of things. What do we want to do? And a series of things came out, you know, including how do we, you know, can we provide some ease to our taxpayers? Do we need to invest in our facilities, et cetera, et cetera? All good dialogue. And that's where, frankly, the idea of putting some money in earmarking facilities was there. And that's when there was a big drop in taxes for 1 year of $10 million. And in the second year of $10 million and $1 or something like that. And that was to answer the Cindy question. If you go to it, it had to be structured. Or the risk would be, if you didn't do it properly, you would lose any future taxing capability. So that's why in that period of time, you know, you see a decrease of 15%, and then 2 years later, an increase back up to that 15% level, or you lose that money forever. And you can see it in the red here, where actually when that decrease was done, it actually brought us down to what it would have been if we had just stayed at CPI the whole way. just kind of coincidentally, as you look at the kind of increment. So that's point number 2, that's a major tax drop or decrease. And then point number 3 in this is, in 2018, we applied for, and Cindy, you're gonna get the terminology, help me here,
Property tax relief,
grant.
yes.
Yeah, so we committed that if we reduced our taxes, we were eligible for this grant that would then end up with more evidence-based, more annual resources. So you can see there was a drop in the tax rate or drop in the levy. And then again, once we reached a point, we kind of recouped so that we at least wouldn't lose the long-term taxing capabilities. Okay, you'll see a number of things like 0.8 and 0.8 and 4, where we did not take CPI, et cetera, et cetera. So those were kind of, I would say, the 3 atypical pieces in the history of this 20-year data set. So that's the levy and what has happened and what boards passed up till present have done over the last 20 years, 17 years. Questions? Okay. If you look at, I gotta get a couple other things in this chart I want to talk to, because one addresses Mary Ann's question. If you looked at 2003, we had $25 million in debt. Okay. And we had a fund balance of $30 million. So what this shows is what happened is for a series of years up through here, I hope my highlighting works, we were paying down the debt through normal course of action. But then starting in 2014 or so, we began abating that debt payment.
Yep.
So we decreased what our net levy was by that amount, but it was all a conscious effort in this case to, this was to kind of push more money or take less money from the tax base. Okay, but and at the same time, we drove our debt from 25 million to 0. Whether 0 is right or wrong is a meaty discussion that fits your question, Mary Ann. But that's kind of what has happened in the debt side. And then the other thing to note is the fund balance. So, I mean, and I'm going to get to expenses in the next section, but the fund balance went from 30 million and it peaked at about 126 million. I mean, it was probably higher than that in any given month, but if you look at it on an annual basis, it peaked at that level, and then since that time, it's come down, but really, it's remained reasonably steady. It hasn't dropped. Obviously, this is all data prior to fiscal 21, where we had the first large capital expenditure. So the picture moving forward will look different because of capital spent. Okay, so that's, my question. So the question is, why do we have $125 million fund balance? It's because we had a huge increase here, and once you jolt it, you're doing it up front, and it keeps paying off every year. It doesn't unless you change expenses, and we'll get to expenses soon here. Okay. The last piece of
Gina has a question.
Good.
Is that right, Gina?
Yes, I have a question. I want to know, Tom, you just said that we don't have the current 2021 spending in there based on the project one. So when are we going to get the numbers that have that in there? Like when do we get to look at what it actually is now?
2021.
Are you using the audit?
Mhm.
Is that the numbers you're using as the audit?
These numbers are all from our consolidated financial statements based on history, so this was all assembled before this year, so we haven't added, we can just add another year in here, just to kind of plug it, just to keep the data series going.
And also to, our audit starts 60 days after July 1st, so we're in our audit right now, which means that the books won't be ready until late October, beginning of November.
So those
Okay,
numbers are just kind of coming off the press is the answer, Gina.
Exactly.
Thank you. I'm appreciative of the historic aspect, especially because you bring so much of the history with you, Tom. It's just did you guys hear that first part of what I said? That I appreciate the historical aspect. Okay, great. What I want to know is like how all of what we've done, because I know that last year on the board, we also did not take the levy. And I want to see the whole picture. And I know we've had this conversation before about making sure that we have information in a timely manner to make sure that we have all of the information. And although this is a nice historical picture, I just really would like to see the larger view. So thank you.
Okay. And we can add it in. I mean, we can add it as tentative information until it's final, if that's a value. So that's an easy ask. So the next piece of information is.
Brad, do you have a question based on that, or do you
Yeah.
wanna?
Go ahead, because maybe you're gonna answer.
The other piece is EAV. So in this case, and I gotta check what, so EAV is supposedly, and I don't know, some measure of property value. Okay, so the question is, as we did all of this, what happened to our property value? And so this presents a trend, and I'm gonna go to graphs in about 2 minutes to show kind of how these things fit together. But our EAV back in 20, whatever it was 1.25 million. And you can see it jumped up to $2.5 million in the first period of time. That was the rocket ship of the early 2000s into the late 2000s. And then what you'll see is it kind of hit the skids and went into reverse. And it took a while for it to kind of recover. Really not until 2017 or something like that. There was a big period, and I'm gonna show you what that looks like graphically, because I think it will paint a better picture if I can move Ralph's face.
Marianne, did you have a question you wanted to ask based on this?
I do, but the graph will be fine for that. I don't need the concrete numbers. Because I have two questions. So that dip you're talking about, Tom, I assume that's the real estate bubble, and that peak is the 2009 peak. And then we crashed, and then the bubble burst, and then we have climbed out of it, with a really firm climb in 2017. And I would say the work that Obama did that led up to that, but putting that aside, like that's correct, right? That's the dip in the line.
We're gonna go there. So
okay. Okay.
When you first saw that, you saw all my charts on one graph, which is
yeah.
Again, that would be my happy place.
Yeah.
But I'm now trying to do it. So the first thing we talked about is, well, CPI is a big number for us, because that's what the levy is tied to. So that's what's happened to CPI over this period of time. Okay. So the next one I want to bring in is EAV.
Yeah.
So that's the EAV, and Marianne, you just basically described it, right?
Okay.
Where good news is that the EAV here is at least higher than it was when it crashed, but this is the mountain of whatever we call those early 2000s, the bubbles, right?
Mhm.
That existed, that frankly had a big impact on the levy. So there's the levy.
Tom, can I pause you for 1 second? I didn't, so that was sort of my framing. I'll just tell you what my two questions are, and I'm not sure you can answer them, but so this is maybe for the future. One of them is, there was a big conversation about the high rises downtown and whether building them and building up business downtown was going to lead to increased EAV. And I'm sort of curious, I'm guessing we don't really know yet, that it's sort of too early to get that data, but I don't, that may be more a question for the village board rather than us, but I don't know whether that's affected EAV in any useful way. I'm seeing that conversation in the community where people are like, the high rises were supposed to ease the property tax thing and it doesn't seem to be happening. So at whatever point we have that information, I'd love to be able to communicate it to people. And then my other question is about Fritz Kagi and the work that he has done to reform property tax collection, and whether we're seeing, my understanding is that when he was elected, what he was trying to do was take these big commercial properties that had been historically very much undervalued, get them valued appropriately, lower income communities that had been historically overvalued, get those adjusted, and that would ease their property tax thing, since they typically can't afford to go to lawyers and ask for and file tax appeals every year the way many Oak Parkers do. And I was not clear on what I voted for him, and I think it's a good thing to fix this, but I wasn't clear on what the effect was going to be on Oak Park as a whole. And I don't know whether we have a sense of what we're expecting there, whether it started taking effect yet or not. So I'm sorry, these may all be like too speculative, but I just those are the things that I'm questioning about this where we are right now, I guess. And maybe this is part of what Gina's asking for. It may be the next stage presentation of in a month or two, maybe all of that information comes together. But anyway, sorry, that's
No, that's the good. I mean, the goal is to stimulate questions and understanding, because ultimately we make decisions on a levy, and that's a big one. So if we can understand it, I will provide a perspective. It's not by no means am I have any more voice here than anyone else on it. I think the construction and a lot of that, I mean, this ends in 2019. And so I think, that will show itself out in my mind in future years. And that's why I like long-term looks, but if there is going to be an impact on things, I think the data is a little bit early for that. So that's one answer that I would have. And then the second one, which I have a perspective on based on our levy history, which is, in terms of EAV, how much of EAV is because of new construction and how much of EAV is because of market? And my belief or understanding, at least in our community, at least for historical, has been there's not a lot. I mean, the amount of new construction as a percentage of the base is pretty low. We don't have much, and the bigger swings here are really because of the property value issues, not that. But I see Ralph nodding. He's probably got a better perspective than me. So
yeah. So things like the West Loop gets popular because some big company has come in there, and then that ends up driving our market higher as well, right? So.
Yeah, Marianne, probably won't surprise you. We worked with a gentleman you may know, David Merriman at UIC, brilliant professor. And we've done a couple of extensive studies of, let's say, TIFs and how TIFs, which are usually promised to over the long term enhance the EAV and then bring down everyone's property taxes, work. And the bottom line is, in Illinois, at least, when you compare like-kind communities, that is similar demographics, similar commercial and residential splits, similar industrial, you see that there not only is no advantage to having TIFs in growing EAV, that the communities similarly situated that did not have TIFs actually grew at a slightly faster rate in their EAV. And what you're always trying to do is determine the externality, right? Whether the TIF itself had value or added value. And we predicated a lot of our modeling on Merriman's work. And the answer is, so far in Illinois, no. There are exceptions, right? Some communities, this is overall. So some communities have used it very effectively, but they have been a minority. Overall, the promised growth in EAV really doesn't generally outstrip just other natural market forces, as where you were sort of going with your question.
Thank you. That's all helpful. I know. I think mostly I'm asking for data we don't have yet, and I will tell the taxpayers that as well. Like, just be patient. We don't know the answers to these questions yet.
So the other kind of couple other pieces on this slide, and then we'll move to the expense side, right? Which is, so as I said, it was this right here, which is the EAV jump, that led to the phase in, that led to this, even though it shows it's lagging, this rocket ship is what drove this. There's a little bit of lag just in terms of the timing of things, okay? So now what's interesting is that when this crashes not because of this. This crashes because of the work of the FAC to say we have a fund balance that needs to be corrected. But what, based on this, when EAV goes down, you don't see our levy going under, going down, okay? So that it's kind of a one-way street. I like to, the area under this curve, my calculus is kind of, this we do have, right? This area in here, okay, and this area in here between these two is representative of fund balance gain, okay, and or debt payoff or incremental or spending above CPI. So that's where you tax more than the CPI. So that went into those three places. For us, I showed it, a bunch of it, 100 million went into fund balance, 25 million went into paying off debt. But if you look at, I'm gonna jump, I gotta play tick all my toggles for a minute. Just because of the way I kind of colors. Okay. This says that we taxed overall $320 million more than if we had just done CPI. Of that, we know, 169 of that was, $322 million incremental total. Of that, 169 was CPI, so we taxed $153 million more than CPI. Okay? The good news is that 100 of that, or a bunch of it, is in our fund balance and paid off debt, and then the difference between those two went into incremental expenses. So I'm gonna shift gears now to the expense side. And I'll probably make this a little bigger. Oh yeah. So, same 20 years, same CPI, and this is our operating expenses as reported. Okay? So if you look at that, what's happened is our operating expenses are up 60%. CPI is up 41%. So we have been spending more than what CPI alone is. And you don't, I mean, there's 1 year, again, where we had to do something and spend it early 1 year and then not the next year. And I don't remember the details, but this tends to be a little more steady than what we've seen in some of those other numbers. But I'll show it graphically in a minute, okay? The other piece in spending, and this is something I've kind of raised, is we talk about capital, and this is total capital, Cindy, and you can talk to it, but this is capital as reported in our overall financials, right? And you'll see, here's what we have spent in capital. And this is the same data, but on a 5-year rolling because of the fluctuations to try to take some of the noise out. So it says in my mind, we've been spending somewhere in the $4, $5, $6, $7, $6 million a year repeatedly. So I guess the question is, we say 4 million, why? What's the difference between 4 and 6.5, not numerically, but in explanation?
So this is all capital, is this also including capital where we buy furniture and cars and buses? Because you also have capital expenditure for that too.
Yeah, it would be capital in your long-term financial reports, yeah, so it includes those.
Yeah, so what you would have is you would have the furniture that was purchased, you would have when we buy our Exempt cars, when we replace buses. It's also other capital equipment that we've also had. And if you remember, I think when I first came into position, I did say that everything was starting to be budgeted or in the past was budgeted into capital, and it really should have been used as a non-capital item, which we have corrected over the last 2 years.
Okay. So we're gonna show that. That I think I'm done with the capital piece for now, just to, it's just to put the numbers, and so separating that out might be good. And the last piece of data that I have, and then I'm gonna go back to I feel like Mr. Whoopi with his 3DDD. I can
There's
see
a reference right there. There's a reference.
Sarah did the, I don't know what he's talking about. And Fred said, yes. Ralph knows, he's gotta know. 3-dimensional blackboard, it was Tennessee tuxedo. Okay, quality reference. So this is our staffing levels as we report them in our same document set.
Mhm.
So it says that in 2004, we had a total of 447 members, and it's just, I'm being real high level, right? And it's broken out into teacher, administrator, and other. And today we have 588. So that means we've increased our staffing here at a level rate at about 32% over this period of time. This looks at the detail. We don't need to get into the who's and the what's. It's just kind of the big picture, because now. Yes.
As to the staffing levels, do we know if there's a corresponding increase in student enrollment during that same time period?
Oh, you just took the bait.
Sorry, predictable.
So that's the common link, and it's interesting because I'll hear, commentary. If you read the articles on the phase-in, what was their reference to? Enrollment growth. That was kind of a key thing we needed to be prepared for. And when the FAC convened 2013, 10 years later, what was the key? Enrollment growth. It was a key assumption in the model. And at that point, the enrollment growth, I know because I was here, was projected to come up to just crest near 4,000 students, I believe. It was 39, 22, 30, it was close to 4,000 students. So because I'm using only the data that is in our consolidated financial statement in there, the student value we have is the average daily attendance number, which I've raised. If you look at our enrollment, it's gone up, I think, by 14% compounded over this whole period of time. If you look at average daily attendance, it is flat over this 17-year period of time.
Yeah, but I will, I'll kick in here and say enrollment is the appropriate figure to look at because you have to be prepared to teach the kids that are enrolled in your school, whether or not they show up. That's what you have to plan for. So, and in fact, that's what the new evidence-based funding formula does. It replaced ADA with enrollment because that's precisely what school districts have to do.
Okay, so that's a good insight. And so the answer to that is 14%, Sarah, over the period of time.
Can you have that graph too, don't you?
I don't have it in this set because that's not in the financial reports. Is enrollment in there?
Enrollment would be in, oh, no. It's just
Okay,
that-
so I'm, the source of this data is all our publicly available those two reports. So I tried to be somewhat, transparent and simple, but I think I agree with Ralph's input. So,
Wait, Tom, I'm sorry. So I'm a little bewildered. I'm not sure I'm understanding this. So enrollment has gone up 14%. Attendance is flat in that time period. So to me, that sounds like we've enrolled a lot of kids, and not necessarily those kids, but an equivalent number of kids have been not attending. That this flatness is just weirdly flat. I guess I think that's what's sort of kind of shocking to me. I don't quite understand how attendance can be this flat for this long of a stretch. Does that?
Can I jump in on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because one of the goals for every district I've worked in has been to have our attendance be anywhere between above 90% or 97%, 98%. And in the 11 years that I've been in this process, I haven't seen us meet that number. And the numbers have hovered somewhere in a very small range. Now, I don't know if we could look at data that would look at multiple school districts similar to ours as far as their attendance ratings and like how their attendance has maintained some level of flat with a very small variance. I would imagine that most of them have. But when we're talking about attendance and we're talking about enrollment, those feel like two very different things to me. So I'm not sure, Tom, if you could explain more about how they relate to the expenditures. The other piece is, if we're going to talk about, if we're looking at, this is why I feel like education is so different than any other industry. And when I was in business and we looked at numbers the same way, if we're looking at the total amount that we've expended and then the increase in the amount of staff, we would also need to have a breakdown on what were the responsibilities for those staff members and what are the demographics of our students. Because if you have a student that has services from 5 different people based on their need, that would require a different amount of employees, right? That means, and if we did not have the same type of students enrolled for years, then those numbers would look different as well. So if we're looking at support services for students or students ensuring that not just that they have a teacher in the classroom, but that they have what they need to be successful academically, that number might, I would love to see the breakdown on that.
Yeah, and I would echo Gina on that. I mean, like, I realize this isn't the focus of your financial presentation today, Tom, but I do think this graph here is super interesting to me. This chart, in part because a lot of the time you see the public kind of frustrated and assuming that they see administrative costs have gone up a lot and they assume it is high paid people at the top tier. And when you actually look at what's happening, it is that we now have actually like a decent number of mental health people working at the school that we didn't 20 years ago, right? So, and similar kinds of things. And so that also falls under administrative, and the public often they just assume things that aren't accurate in that way. But I'm not sure that's like, I sort of feel like that's maybe a conversation to have with Greg and not so much what Tom was trying to get across here, but I do think it's important.
Also, Tom, I love spreadsheets like you love spreadsheets, so Excel is my favorite as well. And I am curious, was this shared with us already? Because I didn't see this in the documents that we got, and I would love for us to have that. I'm not sure where this was made available.
This has not been shared, and the reason is just because it's a lot of what I call dynamics to kind of show how it is. If this were sent out without having the opportunity to discuss it, it would be pretty somewhat useless or less valued. But there's no issue sharing it post, because then people can look at it and understand. But as you can see, I'm kind of clicking through some things.
Thank you. I just want to be mindful that whatever we share, like that all data creates a narrative. And that if we're creating an unbiased narrative, we just need to make sure that we're doing that. That's all.
So the concept of which, attendance, again, I said just using what was in our data set, but there is a different data set, although there has been the question, which is if our enrollment has increased steadily by 15%, our average daily attendance has remained constant, what's driving that? It's a different question.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's what I was trying to get at. And I understand what Ralph was saying about we need to budget for enrollment. So like in terms of the finances, we have to budget for enrollment. But it did seem like if enrollment has gone up 14%, this line has stayed flat, essentially effective attendance has dropped by 14%, right? So,
Yes.
and so that's my sort of a question for administration at some point, not necessarily this presentation, is what's going on there. I'd like to understand what's led to that drop, but it probably doesn't need to be now.
Okay. So now I'm gonna just take those and this is on the cost side, right?
I'm sorry, can I ask you a question? Cindy, I think this is a question for you. How is average daily attendance? Does that include all students enrolled in the district, or does that include all students who are not enrolled? Are we looking at the average daily attendance across the entire district or students in the building for ADA?
My understanding is it's the students in the building.
Okay.
And then what happens at the end of the year, because we put in our claims, we do get from the outplace facilities, we do get days that the students also attended. But that, my understanding is that does not get recorded here.
And I think between Gina and Mary, and you were asking again, this is again from the same data source, but this is a kind of meant to be a very high level overview. So it wasn't to get into every position, but this is just kind of a snapshot of what types of positions made up the district 2013 versus made it up in 2020. So you can see where, this one has gained, this one has gone, there's been some changes in how we keep score, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more detailed than I had, intended to get into a high level financial, but it's from the data set, okay? So I'm gonna finish up and then flip it over to more comparative data. So this side, I'm gonna now take and layer in the staffing, okay? So our staffing is up by 32%, and you can see actually it kind of it didn't increase. The heavy increases have really been from here forward, okay?
Tom, is that staffing number, is that numbers or dollars?
This is counting people.
So
Correct.
number.
This is just looking at it from a people standpoint, and it's everyone is a head, right? There's one that doesn't differentiate an administrator from a support, et cetera, just for this discussion. Okay, again, you can get into sub details, okay? And so then, oh, wait a second, I gotta throw my favorite one in, that's CPI, okay, that's kind of the CPI that we look at. So this yellow line here is now looking at what happened to operating expense over this period of time. And you can see how it actually was pretty close to CPI for getting this 1 year blip. But then it started diverging. Ooh, got that word in there. Calculus and so it started diverging, and I think that diverging also tends to relate to is when our staffing started increasing more. I would say there is some relationship on or about this point in time. So here you had this big change in resources back here, I mean, in levy, et cetera, but then, the resource changes have been more in this gap, okay? And the last one I have here is then now, and again, this uses ADA because that's the way the data is reported. So this is looking at then what's the expense per student, which is basically the yellow divided by the green, and what's happened there. And again, it pretty much follows the yellow here, which is it follows our expenses because this line is reasonably flat. And it shows an acceleration or a divergence starting in this time period and growing over this time period. So again, if you look at that in the financial data, how does that show up? It shows up of the, steadying, the fund balance no longer began increasing, okay, because more resources were being used to support the staff, et cetera, et cetera. I think that was what I had. That's all the buttons I have to push unless you want to get cloudy. And, just to kind of Mitch, you can add in, income side, EAV side, and we can add in the levy side, and all you get is, looks like one of my art projects. So, I'm gonna stop there, and, the intent was kind of a history of the fund balance, history of the levy, how did we get to where we are? And this is kind of the road that has gotten us here. I've got some good thoughts of, how do we make this more current? Do we want to do any deeper dive? Other questions, thoughts before we change to, I guess, comparative views?
I think Gina has her hand up, and I'm also wondering if the three might have any questions as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom, for taking your time to put all this together for us. The question I have is, where we see those increases, if we plan to use this information to drive our decisions, I would like to know specifically what those increases were for and how they panned out over time. And if we have any data that would show the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of those measures that we took that were increased expenditures. Thanks.
Excellent. I think that's a wonderful question. And you're not the first one to ask it, but it's a great thing to make sure as we put in disciplines. So can we correlate between resources and deliverables, right? Kabreem?
First, thanks, Tom, for putting this together. And I do love Excel, and I think I know my wife also with that.
Our wives would get along.
And to Gina's point, because I like to see the causation of, what happened there. So if we increase expenditures for staff and students, and from what I think on your previous chart, our projected numbers for enrollment didn't really meet what our projections were. I'm not sure where the projections come from in your, so on the PowerPoint you have, I'm not sure which year's a projection, where it started and which are the actual numbers. But I'd be curious to know, I don't think we're at almost 4,000 students, are we? But I'll be curious to know, as we increase spending per student, where exactly it went for staff. I mean, and did it have an effect or positive effect or need for, or meet any needs for the students, student outcome? So a lot of data. Now it's fun. I guess we have to now take the data and decipher it and see what makes sense and inform decisions going forward. So I don't know if you have any causation models going forward as far as data, or no?
No, but let me just start with your first question. Enrollment data. So I think it would be a good follow-up because I mean, enrollment has been a huge factor in this data. Okay, you saw if you look at the article from 2003 when they were talking about the phase-in, they said it's coming, and many decisions were based on it's coming and enrollment. So I can't really speak to the specifics prior to 2013, but I will say that in 2013, that's when I have firsthand experience, which is when we had the projection model in 2013 is when it went up as high as 4,000. So we can resurrect that and show the gap of what was projected and what wasn't. But there were decisions made, based on that were, bringing in resources.
Can I answer this question just a little more directly?
Thank
So, every few years we have a demographer who actually does a study of people moving into Oak Park, people moving out of Oak Park, median age, average household, what types of homes are selling. They look at a whole bunch of different factors to try to determine what they believe future enrollment will be. It's a whole niche specialty. And I know Cindy, I'm sure somewhere we have the most recent ones. I think it might be useful. It's actually the last two because we switched demographers at some point and it became a very different picture, which was sort of eye-opening.
Yeah.
So I think maybe for historical purposes, sending both of those demography reports would be really helpful because we were hearing from the first set, it's going to be these big increases based upon enrollment in the grade schools and the new construction, all this stuff. Then the second set, we switched demographers and we get a different picture. So that might help answer some of those more granular questions for you, Greg.
Okay. And then the other ask was make the data available, which I will through Gail, share what we have. So I think with that said, we're ready to move on into I guess what I would call more of a comparative, is that where we are? Perspective?
Yeah. E?
Yeah. What is it?
It's E, I believe.
What's E say?
Comparative data.
That's probably a good name, okay? So I'm gonna stop sharing. So one of the questions asked for Cindy is, if this is our and again, I'm trying to stay in the financial kind of swim lane. We can go into all kinds of other places. But how do our financial metrics compare? And so Cindy, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So we, working with Forecast 5, we did a comparison of Cook West 40. We've used NWPA in the past, but this time we decided to try to use West Cook 40, and these are only based on the high schools. What we looked at was, the fund balance per pupil, the operating expense per pupil, and also the EAV per pupil or students. These are really small, sorry. So the first one is the operating expense per pupil comparison. The group that we used was Lyden, Oak Park River Forest, Proviso Township, Ridgewood, Lyons, Riverside Brookfield, and J.S. Morton. And this one, if you go to the next slide, please. And this one here, Oak Park, is up at the top, it's number 2, and for that, Light was number 1 with 25,168. Oak Park was 22,914, and Proviso was 20,656. The average, I'm just gonna go through a couple of them. The average was 19,441, so we are above what the average is. Next slide.
It's not gonna speak at some point to the adequacy targets.
Yes.
Please just start.
Who's next?
Can you go to the next? The next one is the EAV percentage, which is the equalized assessed value of the homes. And with that, if you go to the next slide, so I'm sort of flip it so you can see it graphically too. Oak Park was right in the middle. We have Ryan's Township, and then Ryden, Ridgewood, Oak Park, and then Proviso Township. And that was, for Oak Park, it was 785,944.
Question for you, just so that I'm clear, is this total EAV in the community, or is this just residential EAV?
It is not residential.
Okay.
It's total. Good point, thank you.
So, I mean, I think that would be a different question, because it, I mean, granted, they're both, you know, businesses and homeowners pay, but we're in a bit of a different dynamic than probably, I don't know all these districts.
Yeah, and at this point, to talk in the forecast, we can have break it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why we have to use it. And the last slide is showing the fund balance on here, and with the fund balance per pupil, Oak Park is in second, second highest here, with Lyden being first. The fund balance here was 107,593,472, and it was divided by 3,396 students, which came up to the 31,682. Now on this too, this is also 2020 information, because 2021 was not loaded yet.
I guess I would like to hear a little bit about the rationale of moving to West 40 High School. Or whether it was Northwest or whatever.
Cook West 40.
NWPA.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because these are very different high schools than what we've been used to seeing in very different communities. What we could, you know, like Tom said, I mean, there is a difference in well,
And also the
not
residential
just the
versus
demographics, but also, you know, in the structure of their taxes. Right, because if you know, especially the Lyden district would be very, very heavily skewed more so than us, you know, in terms of commercial, commercial real estate. Lions might be as well, and also Morton. So I'm just wondering the rationale from switching our comparisons.
Well, there were 3 of them that we normally use. One is Cook West 40, and the WPA is usually the one we use the most. And then we also use the ones that are tier 4 schools. So for this one, we actually asked Mr. Kosky which one he would like us to use.
But I just, my point is, I think that the key here is we need more science in that, in my opinion. Okay, and one of the asks of the Community Finance Committee, I think, is gonna be some input of some criteria and some recommendations on how we should look at ourselves financially. Who should be our peers? Because I don't
Right,
think,
exactly, that's.
I don't think it's any one prefab set, like this NWPA or this, because I mean, you join that club, it needs to be more intentional than that. So I have no marriage to this group or any group, it just kind of sparks the dialogue. I will say this, if you look at this slide here, this is fund balance. When we had this same slide presented 8 years ago, we were the bottom blue, and there wasn't another horse within 5 laps of us. We were so far out of range compared to number 2, it was crazy. And now, you know, you've got other districts that have fund balances that are, you know, in the same order of range where we are. So we've definitely, you know, moved into the pack somewhat. And I did look, because I hadn't paid attention, but if you look at Leiden just put on, you know, I think out of that, there's like $50 million of bonds or something. There's some things they're doing that are investing and that spruce their, you know, they took in a bunch of money that is earmarked for capital. So you gotta be careful when you catch them. I don't know, are they doing a big project?
They do.
They are, yeah, big capital projects, yeah.
Right, so it kind of comes back to the question of Mary Ann again on what do we do? Is that if we were to, you know, fund our, you know, expansion and we took money in advance, we would see an uptick in our funding, so. But I do have an ask of our committee to help us be intentional about who we compare ourselves to. From a financial standpoint, and then obviously we need to make sure that matches from a, you know, from a student performance and everything else. But from a financial standpoint, we should be comparing ourselves to districts that we are intentional of, so. Okay.
All right. Are there questions from any board members on anything that we presented so far in open session? We do still have some more items for closed session.
I have a question. I'm just, oh,
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I'd be delighted to be able to tell the public to stop comparing us to Evanston and here are some actual comparables. That would be great to have some specifics that I could point to, rather than just saying it's not a good comparison, because that's just what everyone defaults to around here, I think. So,
Yeah, that's music to my ears.
yeah.
Well, and why I said this, because I know D97, when they were going through this, they came up with some criteria that were, you know, they said if your EAV is within, you know, 0.5 to 2 of ours, and they have a number of metrics, and then they just go in the data set and say, here are all the districts that fit that box. And those are your comparatives right there. You don't choose them, you're not picking them, you're basing it on data. So that's an approach that we need to consider. Right. The last section is, so this is comparing our financial measures to other districts. So the other thing that we did as a district just in the last year is put together, you know, our own evidence-based model. And if you look, you know, the concept of an evidence-based model is you're using benchmarks, which in a sense compare you to the state as a whole, right? And so I would like for Ralph to kind of talk us and provide just some perspective on that, if he would be kind enough to do so.
Yeah, what I'll do, it's about 10 slides, but real quick, run through the EBF and its genesis and why it is and what it really does and doesn't do. Because if we're going to be talking about utilizing the EBF, which I think we should be, as one of the inputs for evaluating resource allocation decisions, we ought to understand what it does and where it places us and those kind of things. So I believe, Gail, you have the PowerPoint. Can you load that up?
Lisa's going to do that.
And it's just going to be real quick. So already go to the next slide. So the evidence-based funding formula replaced our old foundation system. Under the old foundation system, the state identified a dollar amount per kid that was the same dollar amount per kid that got funded everywhere in the state of Illinois. It was based on absolutely zero educational inputs or outputs. It was pretty much predicated on what the state could afford. And then it had some basic modifiers that went on it for things like special needs and low income, also not based on any educational costs or outputs. So as it turned out, that old foundation level system wasn't adequate in the amount it generated for schools, equitable in its resource allocation, accountable to stakeholders for generating educational outcomes, or based on any evidence. Next slide, please. So not surprisingly, Illinois had the largest funding gap in all of America when it came to schools with high poverty versus schools that didn't have high poverty. If you go to the far right of the graph, that is Illinois. And you go to the far left of the graph, that's Ohio. So Ohio was doing the best job of funding schools that were lower income, et cetera. Illinois, absolutely the worst in the entire country. And this is from the Education Trust. Next slide, please. So what is the evidence-based model? And it's an adequacy model. It was designed by researchers at University of Wisconsin and USC. They looked at 30 years of educational inputs and outputs, and they looked for statistically meaningful correlations between the input on the front end and the educational outcome on the back end. So based on that, they came up with a way of costing out implementing these evidence-based practices in a state. Another key feature is the local capacity target. So school districts are expected to contribute a certain amount to funding education from their own resources based on where they sit statewide in the resource chain. Then there's a base funding minimum. This is sort of a guarantee that no school district would be harmed when we switched formula funding. It's a way to ensure that it wasn't going to be a Robin Hood program that took away from school districts like, frankly, ours, that were investing more per kid than other schools and transferring it to underfunded schools. And I'll get into that a little bit more. It established funding tiers for priority of distributions of new money. And it established a target amount of new money that had to go into education every year over and above the prior year. We never had any of that under our old formula. The new amount that goes in per year is supposed to be at least $300 million over the prior year. The other significant difference is it doesn't create a dollar amount per kid for the whole state. It breaks school funding right down to the district level, predicated on that district's exact student population. Next slide. So this is some of the evidence-based elements that are funded in the model, and I'm showing you the effect sizes. To be statistically significant, an effect size needed to be at least 0.25. So you've heard me frequently say that I support our district utilizing more tutoring with tier 2 intervention teachers. You look at the effect size on that of correlating to enhancing student outcomes, it gets up to 10 times statistically significant. It can be a very, very valuable educational input. And there's a lot more than this. These are just some of the evidence-based models, but what practices, but this is a nice thing to refer to periodically when you're making resource allocation decisions, to see which educational practices provided the greatest bang for the buck from a correlation to enhancing student outcome standpoint. Next slide, please. So the way the model works, there are basically 34 elements that get funded in the model for every school district. About 26 of those, 25 of those are evidence-based. So they're like the practices you saw on the prior slide. The rest of them are just simple building costs. Every building needs to have, for instance, janitorial services, and every building needs an HV system and technology and things like that, back office. So those things are predicated on average costs, and the evidence-based practices are literally based on the cost of implementing those practices using statewide labor markets for determining the cost factor. Then they apply all 34 of these elements to your school district's specific. So I'm gonna use middle school because it's about the easiest example. So first they look at your middle school and they say, all right, enrollment. For every 142 students enrolled in your middle school, you need one core teacher, full-time equivalent for every major subject. And so there's your first cost factor on faculty. And then for every 125 English learners, you need another full-time equivalent faculty position for every core subject. That's additive to your basic enrollment. Then for every 125 special needs students, again, another full-time faculty member. These special needs students are the high incidence special needs children that do not have significant special needs associated with them. Children that have very significant special needs, you really can't reduce to a formula, and they are funded out of formula. And then for every 125 low-income students, you also need a full-time equivalent teacher. So what the model does is districts can have very similar enrollments, but one would be allocated a much higher amount of funding to implement the evidence-based practices just based on its unique demographics, i.e. its concentration of English learners and low-income kids. And then all salary-based elements are adjusted for regional labor market. So in Cook County, for instance, our adjustment is over 1. So whatever the statewide average is, we can get up to 1.25 of the statewide average per dollar. Downstate, there's a floor put on the reduction of the one-time salary, and that would be a 0.9. And the reason for that is salaries downstate have been so deflated, they have a very hard time attracting any sort of quality faculty, et cetera. So it was an equity feature to put that in. And if you're curious where the perfect 1.0 is, it's Peoria, of course it is. Middle America personified. And all that comes together and you get a target amount of resources your district needs to implement all these evidence-based practices that have been shown to generate positive student outcomes. And the student outcomes range from everything that you hear people talk about most often, like test scores on standardized tests, to graduation rates, to dropout rates, to disciplinary rates, to college matriculation rates. So it really gets into the major outcomes you are looking for your educational system to be generating. Next slide. The hold harmless just basically said, look, fiscal year 2018, the model was being implemented. So I summarized the grants. Whatever you got from the state of Illinois in general state aid, supplemental poverty, bilingual, et cetera, 2017, you get again in 2018. This becomes your base funding minimum under the bill. Your base funding minimum doesn't go down unless there's a major cut in school funding. Every single year, if you get a little bit more from the state of Illinois, your base funding minimum goes up. The idea was to transfer more of the responsibility for funding K-12 education to the state and away from local property taxes. And the rationale behind that is Illinois ranks 50th in the nation in the portion of K-12 funding paid for by state resources. We are dead last. And we rank number 1 in the nation in the portion of education funded by local property taxes. So that was the rationale, the two rationales behind the base funding minimum, shifting responsibility to the state and ensuring no school district would be harmed by the change in formula. Next slide, please. So here's where the local capacity comes in. The model then puts every school district in the state of Illinois on a continuum. And it looks at the local capacity that school district has, and it comes up by formula with the portion of their adequacy target, that total dollar amount that the district needs to educate its kids, that should be paid for from local resources rather than from state-based resources. The higher you are up on the ladder from an EAV standpoint, the greater the responsibility to utilize local resources to fund education. There is a 3-year smoothing and some other things for PTEL and drops, et cetera, but that's the bottom line, is you're put on a continuum, and it's really predicated on what your school district ought to be putting in, not necessarily what it does put in. However, if your school district gets additional resources, let's say a TIF district closes down or something like that, and you get a supplemental grant in a given year, that is added to your local capacity target just to keep everything on the up and up for the year in question. Next slide.
And Ralph, if you could define adequacy in this context, I know I've done it before, but I think there are probably folks at home who might not know.
Sure. So your adequacy target is literally all those evidence-based practices that are run through the model, like I did for faculty, based on your school district's unique student population. So there's automatic adjustments for your low income count, your EL concentration, your special needs counts. And then you get this dollar amount, which would be sufficient to implement every one of those evidence-based practices in your district, predicated on your unique student demographic. So that's your adequacy target. That's the target of resources your district would need to implement all evidence-based practices. And then what's interesting is the model then sort of divides districts for distribution of new funding from a priority standpoint. And the highest prioritized districts are those furthest away from their adequacy target. And then the districts at the very top of the funding list are the lowest priority. And so here's how the distribution went in 2020. We just got final numbers for 2021 from ISB today. I didn't have time to add them in here, but they're not much different from here. So in tier 1 districts, where all districts had 67% or less of their adequacy target in current funding between the amount of money they were getting from the state plus their local resources. You add those two amounts together, you divide it by the adequacy target, and they were at 67% or less. These are the worst funded districts in the state. And it's a dynamic number. So the way the model works, that 67.36% will be more like 68.5% this year. As more money goes in, the cutoff moves. Tier 2 districts, which are the second highest priority, are between wherever tier 1 ends in a given year and 90% of adequacy. Tier 3 districts have between 90 and 100% of the resources they need. And tier 4 districts have over 100% of the resources they need to implement every one of the evidence-based practices. And if you're curious about how the distributions go, the first 50% of the new money the state puts in a given year over and above the prior year goes to tier 1. The next 49% of the new resources go to tier 1 again and tier 2 on a pro rata basis. And 0.9% of the new money goes to tier 3 and 0.1% goes to tier 4. Oak Park River Forest High School is a tier 4 district. We are at the very top of the model. What?
Sorry, Rob, I just wanted to clarify my prior question. So adequacy is not a bare minimum, it is not a floor. Adequacy means that that's sufficient for that school to operate optimally based upon the evidence-based practices.
Yeah. For that school to be generating positive student outcomes across the board, whether you're looking at standardized test scores or disciplinary rates or dropout rates or college matriculation rates or graduation, whatever you're looking at is your key educational outcome. That's exactly right. Next slide, please. So the model was really designed to get new money into those tier 1 districts that have been underfunded from the distribution side, and it has worked. This is just giving you a summary of how the new money that's gone into the EBF has actually been distributed since the model was first implemented. If you just go to the far right, so since the model was implemented in 2018, you note that in 2021 there was no new money, but 2022 we started doing again. 89% of the new money has gone to tier 1 districts. 10% has gone to tier 2, and tier 3 and tier 4 have split the final 1%. So the money has been going to those districts that were furthest away from adequacy and needed the most help to start having the resource capacity to implement these evidence-based practices. Next slide. It has also worked powerfully to start addressing the equity gap in per pupil funding by race and ethnicity. So one thing that's really accountable about the new model is it allows you to identify gaps in funding between what a district has and what it ought had by pupil. And then you're able to break it down on a weighted basis per pupil by race, by ethnicity. So at the bottom line there, at the far left, you see in total statewide, those students who attend underfunded schools in the state of Illinois are facing a per pupil funding gap between what they have and what they should have of $4,370 per kid. That said, well, that was in 2018. 2022, it dropped at 4,256. But then look at the differentials when you start breaking it down by white, Black, and Latino. You see that there were much greater differentials by student on a per pupil basis in our school districts that have minority kids than are teaching primarily white kids. And so the good news is the model has also been reducing these gaps by race while reducing it for all students. So it's been working from an equity standpoint across the board. Next slide, please.
Wait, Ralph, I'm sorry, could we go back for 1 sec?
Sure.
Sorry, I just want to be sure I understand that slide. I think it.
Sure, Marianne, I'm just trying to go quick because I talked too much anyway.
Sorry, just go back one for a sec.
Back one.
Yep. So, thank you. Sorry. So this 3620 going to 3572 means that you've improved the gap of how much is budgeted per student by about $50, and that has resulted in a 1% improvement in scores.
No, 1%, a reduction of 1% in the gap.
In the gap
In the funding gap. So that's percentage change in the gap and dollar change in the gap. So there's
I see. Okay. So this is
there's been a greater percentage change or reduction in the gap for Black and brown students than for white students, which makes sense because there was a much higher dollar amount gap per student that Black and brown students typically faced.
Got it.
So,
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Sure. Good question. Happy to answer it. In the geographic allocation of the new funding, you could see that it's worked statewide. So suburban Cook, not including CPS, has realized 178 million in new funding. The Collier County is 274, CPS 184, downstate 327. So the model has actually assisted every district, every area of the state, and it's addressed equity gaps by income, by race, and by ethnicity. So it's been doing a pretty good job. Next slide, please. And I think that might be the end. So what the evidence-based model does, and to Sarah's point, is it identifies those practices which over the last 30 years really have had a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement, and it identifies the funds or resources every district would need to implement every one of those evidence-based practices predicated on its student enrollment. It's an enrollment-based bill. And we are a tier 4 district, which means we have over 100% of the resources we need to implement all those evidence-based practices. So how this could be helpful when we're making resource allocation decisions, it's not as if, we should feel that we have to be strictly bound by implementing just what the evidence says and no more, but we need to have a rationale for why we are engaging in a resource allocation decision that's not necessarily predicated on the evidence based on our unique student population or needs or unique outcomes we are trying to generate here. So it just allows us one more layer of information to use when analyzing resource allocation decisions and understanding why we are making certain decisions and what sort of student outcomes we are hoping to generate with those resource allocations.
Thank you, Ralph. That was a whirlwind tour, but that's great. Does anybody have any questions based on that? Okay, Tom.
I have one. I want to loop back to actually the question that Gina raised based on the data that was historical data, which is, can we correlate, and we've added resources here. And so what might be, obviously it's better to do it as you go, but if we were to look back at where we've added resources over the last decade, and kind of group them into, because I like, Ralph, how you said that the different correlations for the different types of resources is just kind of look at them and see how they fit versus what evidence tells us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that would go part of the way toward toward answering that question. I think what we really want to do, and some of this, right, the evidence-based model's only been around in Illinois since 2018. And so, prior to that time, obviously, the decision makers didn't have the model to utilize as a rubric in any way. And resource allocation decisions, they can't be changed overnight. You have to, be rational about what the time it takes to really, move resource allocation decisions from point A to point B. All that being said, I think Tom, it'd be very valuable information to have all the data that was sort of implied in Gina's question, right? What have been our change in outcomes based on the student outcomes we care about over the time sequence the enhanced spending has gone on? How has that enhanced spending stacked up against the evidence-based practices? Do we understand the rationale for why we went into certain of these decisions from a student outcome standpoint that we were trying to accomplish, and just map out the data? And then once again, it's a robust discussion that allows us to talk about a lot of these decisions in context. And I think that's always a helpful way to make policy decisions.
Ralph, I don't know, maybe you have this on your not-for-profit's website, or is there somewhere we can look to see where the different districts rank according to that ADF?
You mean on the local capacity target?
Yeah, I'm just curious about some of the peer districts that we saw earlier, if they're truly peer districts or just, to Tom's point.
I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, right? So we could certainly get that data for you. I think it's available on ISB's website, but CTBA can get that data all the time because we do this analysis and we actually work with ISB on this stuff. I'm on the professional review panel that looks annually at potentially making recommendations for adjustments in the evidence-based funding model, that we'd make recommendations to the legislature and the governor, because we're watching its implementation. And so I have access to a lot of these data, and then we work these things out with ISB. So that'd be one thing to look at. The other thing would be, which of the tier 4 districts, since all the tier 4 districts have more than 100% of the resources they need, how are they allocating their resources? What are their outcomes? How do their outcomes compare to us? How do their student populations compare to us? To maybe try to find like kinds within that group as well. So there's a number of different ways we could utilize this data to try to come up with comparables that make sense, which is really what you're looking for. You're looking for getting as close as you can to like kinds.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, no, as we talk.
Sounds like a lot of work though.
No, as we talk about just coming up with that, because that data is readily available, right? I mean, it's just a question of mining it and saying, these are districts that are dealing with, they're in our world.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
Okay, Tom, is the Tom Roadshow over for the time being? All right, Tom, I want to thank you very much, and Ralph, for that really exhaustive but quick look. We do also have closed session. So at this point, I am going to move that we enter closed session for the purpose of discussing collective negotiating matters between the district and its employees or their representatives, or deliberations concerning salary schedules for one or more classes of employees. Is there a second?
Second.
Yeah, could you call the roll, please?
Yes, Mr. Martieri,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Kopsky,
Yes.
Dr. Mohanraj,
Yes.
Mr. Arkin,
Yes.
Mr. Henry,
Yes.
Ms. Dixon Spivey.
Yes. All right, if folks could close out of this, we will be back to this room, but we will go to our closed session now.
Nine, right? Yeah, there's 9 other people.
Second, I'm assuming we have a motion to adjourn
And
already,
don't
right?
we need to get our friend back?
Yes,
What's his name? I feel terrible. I don't know his name. Okay.
I will text him right now. Never mind, so.
Ralph's so smiley. There's something.
I've already seconded our motion to adjourn. Someone just needs to put the
Yeah.
motion on the table.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, it's a video game.
God.
Okay, we're going.
Okay. And folks at home, where?
All right.
Okay. Problem solved. All right, I move to adjourn.
Second.
In favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
That's a lot of people. Reverb is about.
Ralph was super helpful, super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Really? Incredible.
We're gonna say it twice. Yeah, I feel way more prepared this